Today on Public Research.
It's clear that he has one eye on avoiding elections. Once the war is over, it will be very hard for him to stay in power, and he knows that. So he's keeping the war going as much as possible.
6 months after October 7th, Israel expert Shaiel Ben-Ephraim returns to the show for an update on the war in Gaza, the Haredi draft law, the viability of the Netanyahu coalition, and much more. Where to begin? We could start with the draft law with the Haredi. We could start with Syria. We could start with the attack on southern Israel. We could start with Al-Shifa. We could start with Rafah. We could start with Netanyahu. We could start with anti-Semitism in America. Do you just feel overwhelmed?
A little bit. Yeah, I try to focus as much as I can on the war effort as the primary thing, because that will decide a lot of the other things. But it's hard not to get sidetracked. Yeah.
What do you think is the most important thing going on right now?
The war in Gaza itself, the actual operation in Gaza is by far the most important thing. It will determine the future of the state of Israel, and it will determine the future of the region. There's a lot of attempts to distract from that by a lot of forces, some intentionally, some unintentionally, but that's where the focus has to be.
So I re-listened to our last interview, and it made me laugh because we were talking about Rafah and the tunnels, and this was the interview we did at least 2 months ago, I think. And you said, well, in the coming days, the Rafah operation will begin, or something like that. We were talking about days, and now it's 2 months later. And honestly, I feel like a month from now, Netanyahu's still going to be saying, we're going in real soon now. I mean, what is he slow walking this war? What's going on?
Yes, there's no other way to look at what's happening, especially in retrospect. It's important to keep in mind that when this war broke out, Israel did not go into Gaza for much longer than people expected. It took over 3 weeks, I think a little bit less than four, before Israel went in. And then at first, it looked like it was trying to limit the operation just to Gaza itself. And the military insisted that they go into Khan Yunis. That took some time until that was approved. And now the whole Rafah thing is slowed down to a much greater degree. So this has actually been a pattern throughout the war. Up until now, there's been enough movement. So you could reasonably say there were other reasons he was being careful, but now it's just so obvious. And of course, it's not just the operation in Rafah; it's also the hostage deal, where he is not giving free rein to the negotiators, so that the negotiations get more and more complex and more difficult to finish. And of course, Hamas is also trying to play for time here for their own reasons. So those two things are just dragging on. The trouble is the delay serves Hamas, but it doesn't serve Israel. And yeah, so there's no question that he's slow walking. Um, the timetable just tells that story very clearly. He also says, not that, but he says there can't be elections. Elections will ruin everything. And it's clear that he has one eye on avoiding elections. Once the war is over, it will be very hard for him, not impossible, because we're talking about Netanyahu, to stay in power. And he knows that. So he's keeping the war going as much as possible. But a lot of people in Israel are aware of this at this point. It's no longer that controversial to say that. It's more controversial to say that to supporters of Israel online than it is to say to Israelis. Israelis basically accept that as true. And that's why there's all these demonstrations against him in Israel right now, just over the last weekend. Very similar to what we saw about the judicial reform before the war.
Yeah, usually there's a clock on Israeli military operations, but I've been saying Netanyahu has another clock, a personal clock, which is, let's just Hey, his poll numbers get a little better the longer as the memory of October 7th fades. That's his clock. So it's dangerous.
Yeah, I don't even know if he thinks that he can win another election. I think he's just trying to put off the election as much as possible. If he was really thinking about another election, what he should be doing, and this is why I didn't really believe he was slow walking until now, is win the war as resoundingly as possible. That will cause a rebound in his man. It might be too late for that, but it would have caused a rebound in his polling numbers. He just may have thought not enough, and he may have been right because he still would be seen as responsible for it. Like the fact that in '73 Israel finished the '73 war quite strongly didn't save Golda Meir, so he might have been thinking that. But that's more like a strategy of there will never be elections again than winning the next elections because people are going to remember how we handled this war. This is not some temporary issue that's going to go away. Whenever there are elections, this is going to be what people are going to be talking about. This is a national trauma that he's responsible for.
Shale, how many children does Benjamin Netanyahu have?
He has two that he claims and one that he semi-claims from a previous marriage.
And they're males, right?
Yes,
And they're young males, and they're able bodied, correct?
yes,
They can walk and talk. Okay. What? Where?
absolutely.
Tell me, where are they right? Where is Yair?
Well, I know that Yair is in Miami
Poolside.
in a swanky apartment complex, and is avoiding, you know, reserve duty. And as for Avner, the other kid, I think he does do reserve duty. I'm not sure he's serving on the front or anything. He keeps a very low profile. He's definitely the more normal of the two. Yair has been very controversial and caused
Well,
a lot of
he's
problems.
not in Gaza because he was at a Purim party in Tel Aviv in a costume.
Are we talking about Avner or Yair now?
Avner. So
Okay.
apparently, as far as I know, both of his sons are not risking their lives in Gaza, which is odd.
Yes.
Is Israel moving out a lot of civilians out of Rafah every day right now?
No. Israel's not doing what it should be doing. It's taken some steps. It's bought some tents. It's told some people to clear to other areas, but peripherally, it's not doing what it needs to do in order to get this done. And it's also continuing, like we said, slow walk. They had an opportunity to meet with American representatives to talk about an operation in Rafah. They canceled that because of the UN resolution abstention. At least that was the excuse. Then it was back on. Then they delayed it. Today they had a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person meeting in preparation for the actual meeting, which they delayed. So they're not trying to get the approval quickly. They're trying to get the approval slowly. They're not trying to evacuate quickly. They're trying to evacuate slowly. But what they're doing seems to me like eventually there will be an operation. Just like there was eventually an invasion of Gaza, and just like eventually they went into Khan Yunis, but as slow as possible. And like you said, the military operation has a clock. The truth is that clock's already expired. The response of the rest of the world to this, they've already completely turned. Was the last one standing aside from the U.S., and they're turning on Israel right now. Hasn't been covered much, but they've said, okay, enough's enough. The German government has said, took them a long time. Donald Trump, in his most recent interview, showed signs that he's sick of the war too. Biden administration's been publicized that they think that this has gone too far and needs to be a ceasefire and Israel should go into Rafah. They're hesitantly willing to allow an operation in Rafah under certain conditions. They don't want it. Israel has no support in the world, none. When the UN resolution was passed, the entire forum stood up and clapped. And you can say everyone's an anti-Semite as much as you want, and in many cases it's true. But Israel had some support, now it has none. That's because the clock has already run out. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't go into Rafah. It should still go, but the price it's going to pay for that is going to be much higher than if they'd gone in when we were talking about it 2 months ago. Still would have been high, so much higher now.
And the tragedy of waiting 6 and probably 7 months until you cut off the supply lines, the tunnels to Egypt, is the fact that my fear is they're going to find Sinwar. I'm no expert, but there's no guarantee he's still in Gaza technically. I my gut feeling is they have some tunnels that are just across the border underground. That's what
Could be.
they're smart guys. They know to operate under hospitals. That's what I would build if I was him, for a situation just like that.
My guess would be in terms of that, that those tunnels exist and are used occasionally to bring in weapons and stuff, but he probably wouldn't go there now because if intel sources have a track on him, they would know where he is. The longer he's there, the easier it is to track. So if I was him and I had a plan like that, I would go in last minute. So the longer you're there, the easier it is to find you. Remember, he's communicating with the outside world in order to do these negotiations. So my guess is Israel goes into Rafah. Rafah's about to fall. Then either he makes a final Hitler-style stand, or he does what you're talking about, goes into a tunnel under Egypt, tries to escape into Egypt, something along those lines.
So how many civilians do you think are being moved out of Rafah per day, if you had to guess?
Right now, almost none.
Uh, I'm flabbergasted. I don't even know what to say. Why?
Um, well, we talked about the political reasons for that because once you remove people,
Yeah.
then you have to strike, or there's less of an impediment to strike, and then you can't waste time. So that's a political element. On a strategic element, the IDF is cooperating with this too to some extent, and I'll explain why. Um, the IDF really doesn't want the people in Rafah to go back to the north. They're very weary of that possibility. They're afraid that they won't be able to secure their return to the north. They're already having trouble controlling the north, and they figure that at that point it'll turn into full-on insurgency, guerrilla warfare in the areas they supposedly control, which they don't fully control. And they also want to use it, and the defense minister agrees, as a pressure on Hamas to agree to um, a hostage release because people in Gaza are putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to do that. They want to go home, and that's one of the few kinds of leverage that Israel has. So there is a strategic reason for that as well. The trouble is, you could remove them to other areas in the south and close to Khan Yunis and in the Mawasi and other areas. Maybe not enough, but start the process, and that's something that they haven't done. So those are the two reasons. There's a political one, there's a strategic one.
I'll tell you what I would have done looking back. And I know people say, oh, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. I don't care. I'm just going to play it right now. What I would have done is I would have gone into. There's people who say, oh, they couldn't have gone into Gaza in the south first, and Egypt would have declared war. I think that's absurd. After October 7th, they could have entered Gaza from any direction they wanted without Egypt going to war. And I would have evacuated. I would have seen the PR disaster coming with the women and the children. I would have had peace barges. I would have brought in women and children into Israel proper for medical care. There's so many things that could have been done to combat the genocide allegations and cut off Rafah right then. I see what you're saying about negotiations, but yeah, I mean it's I I don't know, but at the current pace, I'm doing the math in my head. So I've heard that they're not even going to start this Rafah thing for another month. That's the sense I get. They're still talking about doing a bigger war in the north. And I'm doing the math in my head. The Democrat convention is in August in Chicago. That for me, and I wonder if you agree, that's the real red line. We can't have a 1968 DNC riot. And that's what it will be, especially if they're doing a war with Hezbollah. Do you agree with that?
Yes, yes, I think that from the Biden administration perspective, that is an absolute nightmare. August is a few months away, though. There is time to end this thing. You're right that if there's a full-blown war in the north, it will continue into August. There's no way you could continue a full war in Gaza into August. Having said that, I think the Democratic Convention is a lost cause for Biden, because even if the war stops in the sense of everything's been taken by Israel, there's going to be counterinsurgency operations. There's going to be civilians being killed. Israel doesn't have a day after plan, intentionally so. Therefore, the IDF will be fighting against Hamas there. There's just no way that's not going to be happening. It may not be at the level that it's happening now, but as we know, the people who are talking about this being a genocide, they're not truly responding to events on the ground as honest brokers. They're taking whatever's happening and they're vastly exaggerating the atrocities, quote unquote, that Israel is committing. So there will be things that you can take out of context and talk about that it's a genocide, and they will be happening, and they will be happening during the convention. So that's kind of a lost cause. If Israel is also bombing the bejesus out of Lebanon, it'll be a lot worse. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think Netanyahu um, will not have support for that war, and if he does go in there, it will make the protests that are happening in Israel now look Mickey Mouse, really. Sure, there's people who support it. People who live in the north will support it. His right-wing supporters will be behind him, but the average centrist Israeli in the Tel Aviv area will not support it. A full-on war with Hezbollah, especially because Hezbollah is going to say, if when the war stops in Gaza, we will stop our operations, and they mean it because they don't want a full war. They just want to show that they're participating. That's what everyone thinks. That seems to be their position. That's at least what most Israelis believe. So if Israel goes to war against them, there might be a strategic argument for it, but Israel doesn't have to go to war right now to prevent something. So it'll be a war of choice at a time when the government is so unpopular, that it will just not have support. And then of course the Americans, for the reasons you mentioned, and other reasons too, diplomatic reasons, etc., won't support it. They'll The support that they're going to give that will be way less than what they're giving Rafah now. It will be much more of a red line, and that will make Israelis support it even less. So I think Netanyahu's risk averse. So at the end of the day, I don't see him escalating into all-out war with Iran and trying to destroy Lebanon without his people supporting him, because that's just too much of a roll of the dice for him. So I actually don't see that happen. That's my hot take anyway. But in Gaza, there'll still be fighting in the convention. And it'll be a mess. It'll be a lot like 68, yes.
I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, but we have two, well, we have multiple things, but we have two pretty big events that have just happened. There was a attack on a lot. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
In southern Israel by basically an Iranian proxy militia group out of Iraq, I guess. And then we've just had this Israeli Air Force bombing of. Why don't you explain these two events? But how dangerous is this moment of escalation right now?
In terms of expansion, in terms of expansion of the war into the north, things like that.
In terms of Iran feeling, oh, I don't. You're gonna have to tell me whether Israel attacked an embassy or what building that was they just attacked in Damascus, full of IRGC people. But
Okay, so
yeah,
yeah. So the missiles shot by Iranian militias, that happens occasionally, and that's probably going to happen more now because of what happened. But the big story is the Israeli attack. I should say alleged Israeli attack because Israel's not taking credit for it. But of course, F-35s don't materialize in the sky out of nowhere. Um, so Israel attacked the house of the um, ambassador, the Iranian ambassador, which is in the compound of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. It's right in the heart of the diplomatic sector, so it's really very close also to the Canadian embassy, and also very close to a hospital. And technically, it's a violation of international law because it's in the compound of the consulate, which is protected. However, made sure not to kill the ambassador. That was intentional and based on intel. From what I'm hearing, they had opportunities to hit that in the past and hadn't because they didn't want to kill the ambassador. Not that they care about the ambassador, but because it's an escalation in terms of diplomacy. The meeting today was too much of an opportunity to pass up. Not only did it have the leader of the IRGC in the entire Lebanese Syrian sector, but also his deputy and several of his most important contacts. So they had all the people in the room that are running that operation, the operation by which Iran arms Hezbollah and the other Shiite militias in Lebanon and Syria. This guy was the replacement for Qasem Soleimani, who Trump had assassinated a few years ago, and he had had a great success in rebuilding a lot of the networks that Soleimani had built that had degenerated since, and the stronger than expected Hezbollah response to October 7th. So yeah, and he's been working in the area for Iran for over 20 years. So he's one of these very difficult to replace individuals. And it also shows Iran that Israel has penetrated its highest echelons and that they're not safe anywhere and that they'll pay a cost for their role in October 7th and in the escalation in Lebanon. So it's a big achievement for Israel. It couldn't have gone better.
How
And yeah,
how scared are you about what Iran might attempt now because of it? Are you scared that you might wake up in a few days and there's been, they've actually used the Houthis or whatever to hit something in southern Israel or what?
nothing. No, Iran doesn't scare me in that regard. First of all, the Houthis have very limited ability to hit Israel. They've hit Israeli territory, but they've done no damage. Their main threat is naval, and the United States is actually doing an underrated job in handling that. The reason we haven't heard about that much lately. They're still operating, they're still interfering, but shipping has gone back to normal more or less. So, that was a success for the US Navy and its coalition. Iran has proved that its strategy is to fight Israel until the last Syrian and the last Lebanese. They don't want to risk their own home country. Uh, they they never have, and I don't think they will. What they will do is probably escalate response from Hezbollah for a while and try to hit Israeli targets abroad. They've had very limited success with that. Again, because Israeli intelligence has penetrated their networks. Their network in Istanbul fell completely to Mossad and Turkish intelligence during this war when they tried to pull off attacks like that. And remember, for Soleimani, everyone was worried about their reply, and it was very muted. Same with the assassination of Mornia. Everyone was very concerned. This has happened over and over again. Iran's capabilities aren't what they used to be, and they don't want to bring attacks on themselves. And that's especially true, I believe, with the United States having a lot of assets stationed in the area. This is a good time for Iran to stay under the radar in terms of allowing other people to fight for them and see if they can cause Israel permanent damage in this war. And that's why I say that Gaza is the most important thing. Everything else is a distraction right now. Israel can't and won't defeat Iran definitively, but it can make sure to safeguard its deterrence, its reputation, and its stability by winning the war in Gaza fully and completely. Escalating in Lebanon is a mistake. Israel won't be able to finish that war on good terms. And Iran knows that escalating to its country is a mistake too.
What is the percentage chance that this Supreme Court action regarding the Haredi draft controversy brings down this government in the next 2 to 3 months?
That is a very good question that I will have a hard time answering. If you'd asked me a couple days ago, I would have said higher than I'd say now. Um, so the
Why
Haredim
is
have
that? Why
shown
is that? Why is the percentage change?
the Haredim have shown that a lot of them are willing to stay in the government regardless of what happens. The reason being that they no longer have anything to gain from from leaving. So what people thought, the reason what happened is the Supreme Court decision was such a shock isn't because they didn't side with the government. No one really expected them to. but it's rather because it was so final. They said, you're going to stop funding, you're going to stop now. What people expected was for them to say, stop funding unless, until, blah, blah, blah. Um, because of that, if there's elections now, the status quo freezes. Now, if the status quo had been frozen on terms that were good for the Haredim, that might have meant, okay, let's go to elections. But now it would be frozen on terms that are bad for them. So now they think if we go to elections, we're going to not have funding for all the months of the elections. So better we stay in the government and try to force the government to pass a law that benefits us. So a very likely outcome of this is the Haredim get some kind of bill like that passed, or really try to get a bill like that passed, and that means that Gantz and Eisenkot leave the government. To some extent, Gantz and Eisenkot leaving the government is pretty much a fait accompli at this point. They may wait another month, they may not, until it's clear where the government is going with this law. But Netanyahu is going to have to choose between the Haredi parties and Gantz, and he's going to choose the Haredi parties. It's not even a question. They're much more loyal. He can work with them more easily. They have a long partnership. Gantz is an unreliable partner from his perspective because Gantz wants to be prime minister. Gantz can and will stab him in the back when it's right for him, and that's expected. The Haredim, it's less of a zero-sum game. They have differences of opinion, but they also both want the government to survive. So I think the bread is buttered in that direction. But so that won't lead to elections directly. But with Gantz and Eisenkot leaving and Gidon Saar saying he's not going in, Gidon Saar already left, by the way.
Because he didn't get
Um,
into the war cabinet. Yeah.
he didn't get into the war cabinet, and now he was asked if they offer you a war cabinet seat, will you go in? And he said no, because he realizes how unpopular the government is. I think he'll stand by it. Not principles, again, just political expediency. So what'll happen is Eisenkot and Gantz are going to be out of the government, and Saar won't go in, Lapid won't go in, no one will go in. So it'll be a narrow right-wing government at a time where that's untenable in terms of the public. So what you're going to see, in my opinion, is the protests coming back at a much higher velocity than they are right now, and the country again being shook to its core, with the reforms, but more so because the opposition has gained supporters, and by moving to a more narrow government, they're going to exacerbate that. I would do the same if I was Netanyahu. He doesn't have, I mean, I would resign if I was Netanyahu. But if I had Netanyahu's psychology, I would do the same. That's the logical thing for him to do. But it also is very dangerous. All this leads to Netanyahu falling at some point. It's just a question of when. The time horizon doesn't look to me like it's going to be 2, 3 months. It looks to me like it'll be about a year.
Just for the audience, let's just briefly explain this Haredi thing. So they were what, 3% of the population in the 70s or something like that, and now they're about 12%.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's exactly right. And they're projected to be in the 20% by 2050.
They have a lot of kids. So they have
Yeah.
a pretty amazing deal in Israel. They get paid to study the Torah all day, or a lot of them do. They don't work that much in the private. They don't contribute a lot to the public coffers, the welfare state. And then on top of it, I mean, I almost admire this, the chutzpah. And then they get all these public benefits, and then they refuse to serve in the military or some. You am I wrong there?
No, everything you said is right. The only qualification is the vast majority. There are Haredim who serve, but we're talking about a few hundred. The numbers are very low. That's, by the way, one of the reasons that the decision was made by the courts is because for years the government was saying we're going to raise the number until it's an acceptable number, and they haven't. They haven't been able to, or they haven't even really tried. I don't know. Depends on who you ask.
And that
But it's remained a few hundred.
and that's I've heard that's partially because of the dating market. Because I've heard that if you're Haredi and you join the military, your value in the sort of dating market, you're seen as more secular. And that's sort of why I think they have to just draft them, rather than this pressure thing. So what is Did it start today that the funding is cut, or
Yeah, yeah. So the funding has been cut, but we need to be very precise about this. Um, it's not that big a financial hit for the yeshivot. So what's been cut is not the funding to any yeshiva where these men are studying, but rather the amount that is allocated to individuals between the ages of 18 and 26. 26 being the age after which, if you haven't served in the army until then, you'll never serve. So that's been cut. That's about 300 million shekels, about 20% of their funding, a significant amount, but not anything that they can't overcome. No other arm of the government is allowed to make up the funding by law. It doesn't mean they won't, but at least they'll be trying to trace that, and maybe they won't. What I've seen the yeshivot are saying, and I believe them, is that they'll be able to privately raise those funds, and they're allowed to elsewhere. They said, it's not a big deal. We can raise the funds. So that's another reason I think the government's not going to fall because I don't think this really hurts the yeshivot all that much. I don't think this forces anyone to go to the army or anything like that. It's symbolic and it's important, and most Israelis are very happy about it because one of the major sticking points is that the Israeli taxpayer funds this. So this will start to change that. But this doesn't force them to go to the army. There's going to be another hearing about that in May. And then they'll decide whether the Haredi men of this age have to go to the army or not, or at least whether they'll get draft notices. That hasn't been decided yet. By
and their
law, at this point, they probably should, but the court is going to discuss that
and
before.
their
Yeah,
leader, I forget his name. He said, "We'll leave the country if you force us to go into the army." Do you buy that, or is that a bluff?
that was the main Sephardic rabbi of Israel. So that wasn't even, just some random political leader. He's a major institutional figure. No, I don't think anyone buys that. There might be some people who leave, but there really is no country in the world that is going to want to take hundreds of thousands of people without
You're, so
any
the U.S.
particular.
government isn't going to pay them to read the Torah all day? Is that really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there's two problems here. One is they don't have any, no offense to religious Jews, but
No
that,
offense.
studying the Torah is not a marketable skill, and countries don't necessarily give visas to people like that. A country, just about every country in the world awards visas and awards citizenship to people that feel can contribute to the economy. And even if they were allowed in, they would have to work for a living. And at in the end of the day, Israel is going to allow them to get funds in various ways. It just might they just might have some of them might have to go to the army. So I think in the end of the day, they're going to get a better deal in Israel than anywhere else. There's a few that have American citizenship, relatives in the U.S. can leave. I don't think that's the majority.
Uh,
I know what most Israelis are saying when they say leave is go ahead.
yeah, no,
That's
I have the translate, Google Translate. I read all the comments like, can I buy you the ticket, please? I'll take you
that is
there.
that is about 90% of the people who are not Orthodox are saying that. Yes.
I just saw a headline that Smotrich is blocking the purchase of planes from America over settlement expansion. Is that true?
He wants to. That is a hopeless cause on his part. Yeah, because the Americans are sanctioning a few settlers and a couple of illegal settlements, something very minor, very symbolic. Uh, Smotrich is a man of symbolism, and a big supporter of the settlements. He's also doing terribly in the polls, so he needs headlines. So this is a way to get headlines, tying it to the settlers, the right wingers, the extreme right wingers will agree, but trying to mess with the defense ministry's funding, especially with F-35s, is actually it's such a fool's errand. You're running against all the most powerful systems in Israel and public opinion, of course, in time of war. So this is a big PR mistake on his part, and he's gonna fold like a yard chair on this issue. It's not gonna fly for
I
Smotrich.
will say about Smotrich, he looks better in Ben Veer. I always first time I
That's
saw
not hard.
first time I saw Smotrich, I was like, he looks like a just for men like beard model, you know.
He's not a bad looking guy. I've met Smotrich. He's not a bad looking guy. He's also he's not dumb. And he's quite charismatic. Yeah. He's been surprisingly bad at playing the political game. And I think he's going to disappear from politics very soon. Ben Gvir, on the other hand, get used to him. He's going to be around forever. He's going to be. I hope he's never going to be prime minister, but who knows with the way things go in the world. But he's going to be there forever as the populist right wing face of racist Israel because he is a brilliant man. He knows how to sound almost rational. When people take his quotes out of context, and he does sound insane. But if you ever listen to an interview with Ben Gvir with subtitles or something, he knows how to be almost convincing to even to normal people, and he knows how to stir populist sentiment, kind of the way that Trump knows how to do it. He's a very talented man in the worst possible sense of the word. So yeah, he'll be around.
Yeah,
Smotrich is flash in the pan.
that's why,
He's
yeah,
about done.
that's why I love to talk to you because you speak the language. I consume as much Israeli English language media as I can get, but I don't speak the language. So, for instance, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, I don't really. I just go on visuals, really. One looks sort of like a slob. Yeah, but they don't.
Being a Slav
Yeah,
has never prevented people from
yeah,
having a good career in Israel. Remember, Ariel Sharon was prime minister. He could have been prime minister for life if he hadn't had that stroke. And that guy weighed, I don't know how many pounds. He's easily the fattest person I've ever met in my entire life. Like he basically took the two other fattest people I've ever met and then like combined them. That's how
but
big he was. He
but
he was a truck.
a great general as a young man.
Great general.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Brilliant political mind. But yeah, my point is
yeah.
being a Slav in Israel, it's for better or for worse, Israel's not as superficial as the United States is.
Is it a coincidence that Smotrich and Ben Gvir don't have? I mean, I guess they can technically sort of speak English, but not well. Is that a coincidence that like sort of the far right guys don't really speak great English?
No, it's not a coincidence. It's because they don't operate in the world of the world. They're not in academia, they're not in high tech, they're not in diplomacy, they're not in all those things that you need English in order to operate in. In order to make friends among the extreme right, knowing English is not particularly an asset. And being able to achieve things on the diplomatic realm is not something that they have any interest in doing. So English just isn't useful or necessary for them. It is possible. I mean, Mayor Kahana was American, it is possible to be on that side of the spectrum and know English, but it's just not essential.
Yeah. So in the months since we've spoken, I've been consuming all the, like I say, all the English language I can get. I've been watching. I had a trip to Canada, so I had a lot of time to listen to stuff. I listened to all the Moshe Feiglin I could find in English because he just sort of, there's something about that guy, that his eyes, and he's just sort of a interesting figure. And I've been listening. I sent you that Jonathan Pollard thing. I don't know if you did. You watch any of that?
I did. I watched a couple minutes. Yeah, quite the odd couple. Yeah.
By the way, he says he's personal friends with Ben Gvir, and he's talking about nuking Gaza. And
Which one of them?
oh,
Feiglin or Pollard?
Pollard says he's personal friends, and the guy's talking about we're going to take over Jordan. We should nuke Gaza. So that's scary. But so I've been watching all this media on one side, and then I've been seeing the crazy. I mean, for instance, I did some research. Do you know on what day the Intercept said that Israel was committing genocide? You want to guess?
Probably a few days before the invasion.
No, it was October 14th.
Yeah,
Casualties were below 4,000, I think. And it was
yeah,
already.
that's well before the invasion. Yeah, the invasion was towards the end of October, beginning of November. So yeah, I'd heard that this was a genocide well before that. This was all pre-planned. Um, it was going to be a genocide no matter what Israel did.
Well,
Whoever came up with that campaign, they were definitely inspired by the apartheid campaign. just use a bad word and throw it at Israel endlessly, and it'll stick.
But, and this is why it's so difficult. I also have been watching. I'm going to screen share with you. Okay. This is a podcast called Two Nice Jewish Boys. Do you know these guys by any chance?
Yeah, yeah, I do.
Yeah. So I watched this the other day. Now, to be fair, this is 3 months ago, and I'm pretty certain they knew victims on October 7th. So, imagine if someone you knew was killed brutally. But this,
Oh, I do. I know people who were killed on October 7th.
yeah, these guys do. I'm just trying to, give context.
Yeah.
This was chilling to listen to, so I just want to play this for you.
Talk about, by the
Yeah.
way, which is just unbelievable.
But just to finish my point,
Yeah.
we didn't like what we're saying is far from enough.
Oh yeah,
It's far from enough.
yeah. It is. Yeah, it's just weakness. We're just.
And now there are
completely-
briefings that we're going to strike less from the air because of American pressure, which means more soldiers on the ground will die because we're deterred by the Americans from doing what has to be done.
Yeah.
That's disturbing.
I mean, we talked about this a lot in the first episodes that we did after October 7th. But the Israeli response to what happened on October 7th is just unacceptably weak, and it's beyond criticism. And we keep giving in to pressure, and more pressure, and more pressure. Ultimately, there are Israeli commentators who are saying this, but ultimately, what needs to happen is, and I think this is in order of priority,
Systematic destruction.
Israel needs to take Gaza. We need to take it, meaning we need to, and not a demilitarized zone, which I keep seeing these huge billboards around Israel, probably by the same organizations, and not destroying Hamas or anything like that. Our main goal needs to be to conquer Gaza and ultimately to clean it of the Palestinian, cleanse it. Ethnic cleansing. It's not ethnic cleansing. It's non-Israeli citizen cleansing, okay? It's cleansing of the enemy. We need to cleanse it of Palestinians as much as possible, either by pushing them into Egypt or finding some other solution of getting them into Jordan or Syria, or I don't care.
Or as refugees in the West.
Or as refugees in the West. Yeah, there's plenty of European countries who are talking about, we want to Scotland, right? It was like saying, we'll be happy to, I think it was Scotland, they say, we'll be happy to take it. Well, here you go. Here's a boat full of 100,000 of them. No, but seriously, get rid of them as quickly and as efficiently as possible and re-inhabit the land. Okay? Create a new border. Where the border between Gaza and Egypt is now is the border of Israel and Egypt. And
I mean, I could go on, but it literally sort of gave me chills to listen to that.
Well, let's be very clear. They're calling for war crimes, admittedly calling for ethnic cleansing. That's something that is unacceptable, and that everyone who supports Israel needs to be united around the fact that we are not Hamas. We don't commit war crimes. We're defending ourselves. Our fight is not against Hamas, but against the Palestinians. That's something that we all have to remember. And what they said is shameful.
How common is that view in Israel now?
That's a tough question to answer because it's hard to separate between the people who are saying these things to blow off steam and the people who mean it as a policy recommendation. I think the people in this podcast are saying it as a policy recommendation. There's an element of both there, but that's what I think they're doing. I think that's definitely a minority. There's a majority of Israelis that have said things like that, especially early on in the war, including very left-wing people. But the amount of people who would actually support a policy like that, I believe, is about too high, probably in the 30s, between 30 and 40%. That would be my guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like on one hand, the people calling it genocide called it genocide at 3,000 deaths. Obviously absurd. But on the other hand, I'm hearing this stuff, and so, I mean, one thing is, did the ICJ trial and the fact that South Africa based so much of their evidence on these statements, from these ministers saying we should nuke Gaza, the agriculture minister, and these just loose cannons, is there any sense in Israel we need to police this a little more, this kind of language?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, there's a few takeaways from the ICJ as far as Israelis are concerned. The main one is that it's unjust, anti-Semitic, because that's what the average Israeli thinks. But the average Israeli also thinks those statements don't contribute to anything. What I've heard so many Israelis say is there's a difference between what, trolls say online or you are blowing off steam, and what a government official says. And government officials should absolutely not be saying stuff like that. And it's particularly stupid. And again, this is what people are saying, including I agree with them, when that's not even your policy. It's not the Israeli policy. Israel's not committing ethnic cleansing. Far from it. It's hasn't removed Palestinians even to safety temporarily elsewhere because it's afraid of allegations that it's going to commit ethnic cleansing. So to some extent, it hasn't even been good for the Palestinians. Israel's so afraid of it. I don't think it would have been bad for the Palestinians to go into Egypt or go into Israel temporarily and go back. The trouble is these allegations of ethnic cleansing will immediately be leveled, and that can't happen. So Israel has actually been very careful not to do this and to actually be above suspicion in that sense. And yet it has people saying that, op-eds encouraging that. The closest Israel's come to saying they should do that as a policy, Gila Gamliel wrote an op-ed about it. But yeah, the policy has been above reproach. So it's stupid to fall into that trap. But yeah, they have. And yes, there's been less statements like that, if you've noticed, since the ICJ. Uh, Israel's under trial right now. And it's going to be terrible for Israel if it loses. It'll take a couple of years, but it'll be terrible for Israel if it loses. It's currently under supervision for various things. It has to give in position papers and all that. And by the way, it's been cooperating quite well with that. That hasn't been getting a lot of publicity because Israel wants to beat these charges. Because if it doesn't, it'll be used to bat Israel for years to come, and it might end up being the basis for ICC arrest warrants, various arrest warrants around the world. It'll be a catastrophe. So yeah, both in the official level and public opinion level, there is opposition to those kind of statements, and we're seeing less of them.
So, as I've been watching sort of members of the Israeli far right that speak English, like Jonathan Pollard, Moshe Feiglin, these guys, over the months, my sense is this: the word that comes to mind when I listen to them is delusional. And like they often say the left is delusional, but actually the far right in Israel are the really delusional people. Moshe Feiglin, for instance, believes the borders of Israel are the Nile and the Euphrates, Egypt and Iraq. Jonathan Pollard says nuke Gaza, take over Jordan. And there was a skit on the Israeli SNL you might have seen.
It's nehederet, yeah.
Where they sing "Without the World." It's very funny. We don't need you for anything. And then one of the Netanyahu cabinet sings it, and one of the religious members says, "God will protect us," or maybe sometimes he does. which is funny. But literally, when that economist came out and said Israel alone, Jonathan Pollard on his show said he loved it. He said he was going to frame it, and he started crying and saying like how beautiful it was, and there is this. And these guys too, like they really don't think they need America. And I don't. Who's going to fill the breach if the alliance with the U.S. collapses? Who would?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. Yeah, first, you've touched on a very important point, which is that what separates the extreme right from the pragmatic right is a belief in the role of divinity in Israeli security. That's something that I think is important to tease out the ramifications of this. Whether we're talking about the extreme settlers, the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches of the world, or we're talking about the Haredis, they have a lot of differences. They have one thing in common. They believe that God protects Israel, not the military and not its alliances with its allies. And that means that when push comes to shove, if you need to choose between the borders of Israel and it having no allies and being under international sanctions, you choose having no allies and international sanctions because that way you make sure that God is with you. And that's a major dividing line in the right. That most right wingers are, or half of them at least, are on the sane side of that and believe that the most important thing is the IDF and the alliance with the United States. As for who's going to step into the breach, that's another very important point. You're asking really great questions as usual. The answer to that is no one. No one is going to step into the breach of the United States for two reasons. First, no one has technology as advanced as the United States. So Israel depends on American technology for its advantage because Israel doesn't have numerical advantage. It doesn't have quantitative advantage. So it needs qualitative advantage. That means it needs the best weapon systems in the world. The United States doesn't have any rivals in terms of the highest quality weapon systems in the world. There's no equivalent to the F-35. The Sukhois and MiGs are not in the same league. The Chinese stuff is garbage. You just can't compare it. Second, Israel's alliance with the United States is based on common values. The United States feels that supporting Israel is the right thing to do. Therefore, it does things that sometimes are against its interests, like constantly vetoing resolutions from the rest of the world. No other country is going to do that without the depth of feeling the United States has for Israel. Other countries are happy to make deals with Israel. I've worked for the Israeli government and I've made deals with countries all over the place. Everyone's happy to make deals, but then they'll hide and will not show support in public. As soon as there's a cost to the support, they're out of here. That is somewhat true for the EU, even though the EU has been more loyal to Israel than people think, especially during this war. But it's beyond true for any other country anywhere else in the world. Whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about obviously the Muslim world, we're talking about the Far East, Latin America, they have zero interest in publicly supporting Israel because of the cost. But even if they did support Israel, they don't have the technology to give us that will help. So the United States is absolutely irreplaceable. That doesn't mean that if the United States support was less, Israel would necessarily cease existing, but it would be so much harder. Just imagine Israel without better weapon systems than its enemies and with sanctions levied on it from the UN. That would make life much more difficult. And that's what Israel's facing without the US. Russia or China are never going to replace the US. Never. They don't have the affinity ideologically, and they don't have the interest.
If we talk about a two-state solution, I've been hearing a lot about topography as a problem with it. That the West Bank overlooks the main population center in Israel. That's true, correct?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So how isn't the main problem to get to the two-state solution, the fear would be this, right? Okay, the first election, they don't elect Hamas. Okay, fine. Second election, they do. And then you get intelligence, they're going to bring in some huge missiles from Iran. And what do you do then? Is that the sticking point? And do you have an answer for that?
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's two sticking points. Security being probably the main one, and the second being the biblical and historical connection of the Jewish people to Judea and Samaria, which matters a lot to many Israelis, not just the fringe that we talked about, but also going well into the rest of the right wing and even the moderate left. But let's focus on security. These are very difficult issues. The Israeli government and the United States have come up with various solutions to them, which are more or less acceptable depending on who you are. Traditionally, the Israeli position has always been that it will control the Jordan River so that there isn't an easy transfer of arms, terrorists, etc., from Jordan into the West Bank. In the past, it also controlled Philadelphia, which performed a similar function leading into Gaza. So the Israeli position would be that it would need to control that. It would want some sort of ability to police what comes in through ports and the airports. And it's always wanted the Palestinian state to remain demilitarized. So those are the precautions that Israel would take. I think there's plenty of risk involved in a two-state solution. It's one of the reasons it hasn't happened. But we've also seen how much risk there is involved in not resolving this conflict. So it's just a question of a trade-off of what you think the greater risk factor is. And I believe that over the long term, a two-state solution, while involving many risks, also involves the opportunity of actually resolving the conflict, which not having a Palestinian state does not present that opportunity.
Yeah, I think the Israeli far right may go down as the people that create a one state that the people who hate Israel want so much. That might be their legacy, ironically.
Yeah.
What is so bad about the way the war's been managed is they're going to do this Rafah thing, but like we said, it's going to be 7 months. So even once you do that, I mean, they might be gone. First of all, if you had to grade the war planning, what would your grade be this far?
Am I grading the military? Am I grading the government?
Well, just how Israel has done the war. Let's just say that.
That's a tough one. B minus.
And I understand that the troops themselves have done a good job executing the mission. I mean, they've done the amount of casualties is still below 300. That's amazing. The U.S. Army was predicting much higher than that. But the war plan. So, what should be the red line in the hostage negotiations, do you think? They can't release all the prisoners for the hostages. What number should sort of be the ceiling?
That's not a problem anymore. It's whether whether you want to say it's a good or not is more of a philosophical question of, I don't think it really matters all that much on a philosophical moral level if you release 700 bloodthirsty terrorists or 1,000 bloodthirsty terrorists. At the end of the day, you've made that decision to release them. And I think Israelis are so concerned for the hostages that we all agree that a lot of prisoners should be released. The number has more or less been agreed. The gaps are about 200 prisoners. So the gaps are between 700 and 950. Israel wanting to release 700, Hamas wanting to release 950. Israel wants to select the most bloodthirsty terrorists who are released, and Hamas wants to be able to select the most bloodthirsty terrorists who are released. So the differences there are relatively minute. That's as small as the differences are. There's much bigger differences in allowing people from the south to go to the north, which we both agree is not really something that Israel should be insisting on all that much if it wants to go into Rafah, but that's the Israeli position. But the big sticking point, I think, is the question of Israel withdrawing from Gaza and ending the war, because that's what Hamas has been insisting all along. Look, there's, I'm pretty friendly to the Biden administration. I'm known for that, but I don't trust what they say about there being a chance for a deal. I think they bullshit quite a bit, because they know that those two issues that I just mentioned, withdrawal from Gaza, end to the war, are insoluble. Israel's never going to agree to that. And it doesn't look like Hamas is going to agree to waive that. So what the United States is doing now is trying to get everything else solved, and maybe that will work. But I don't think that that overcomes the major problem, which is that if Israel stops the war, it loses, and Hamas wants Israel to stop the war for that very reason. It's a dispute over who won the war. Hamas is becoming more and more self-confident because it doesn't see that Israel is actually willing to go into Rafah and finish them off. So until Israel shows that it's willing to do that, not by announcing it for the gazillionth time, but by actually doing it, that's going to remain the situation. I don't think that Hamas is going to say, yeah, sure, okay, restart the war once this is done. I don't see them doing that. I don't think there's going to be a deal.
Who's the most important rich person in Israel?
Probably Sherry Arison, and there's Nochi Dankner.
What's the wealth from?
Well, so all of Israel is Israel doesn't really have a free market. Israel is too small to have a genuinely free market. It has cartels. Um, so there's only two or three companies that make dairy products, two or three companies who make cell phones, two or three cable, satellite companies, all that. banks. There's a bunch of banks, but some people own more than one, you know. Um, so you have families that have a controlling share of just about every sector in the country, and they are the people who really run the country, and they have more power than the prime minister in terms of economy for sure, just like in the United States. But in the United States, there's more corporations. Here, it's actually in fewer hands.
Right.
This is one of the major deficits in Israeli democracy, one that's not talked about because it's very difficult to solve. And they've also harmed Israeli economy by um, pressuring Israel into having tariffs on foreign goods so that they can continue to leverage their domination over the market. Yeah, so you have these oligarchs, basically, friendly oligarchs, nice people. They don't get anyone assassinated, but it's not Russia, but their power in the economy is comparable
So you
to
said
what it was in the 90s in
you
Russia.
said Sherry, what
Sherry
names?
Harrison and Nochi Dankner are two,
Donkner. Okay.
yeah, Dankner, yeah,
And what are their politics?
center left.
Central left. Okay.
Pretty much all the yeah, all the tycoons are center left. They're old establishment folks. But with center left does it means that they supported probably Netanyahu at his peak. They supported certainly Kadima. Now they probably support Benny Gantz. Very establishment, but yeah, very weary of the extreme right wing and the Haredis and all that. Yeah.
Who is the Tucker Carlson of Israel? Like TV right wing pundit. Most
Yeah, there's what's his name? I'm blanking on Yanon Magal is one. Um, Gadi Taub is another.
I know Gadi. He speaks English. Okay.
Yeah, Gadi Taub was a former professor. He's a real asset to them because he's like what's his name? Like you have that guy De Sosa in the US. You have these people
Oh, Danish.
with yeah, that guy. Yeah. So he's kind of similar. He has academic credentials, but he's gone way off the deep end.
Oh,
He
I
also
think
has a
you're talking about someone else. I don't think I know Dinesh D'Souza went to Dartmouth, but maybe you're talking about Jordan Peterson or something.
Mead. There's Walter Russell Mead is like that.
Okay.
Although Russell Mead is more of an intellectual heavyweight
Serious,
than Taub is.
But Todd says I
Um,
used to be a liberal and then I woke up, basically.
yes, he's a very interesting man. I used to work with him at Hebrew University. I know him a little bit. He was like a not a pop idol. He presented a pop show on pop music, and he had an earring. He was a cool, good-looking guy. Then he became a professor, a liberal professor, and then he started going to strip clubs a lot to write a book about strip clubs, and he got a very bad reputation, which I will not go into. And then he became a extreme right winger, in a very populist Trumpian sense. Very, very, his views would be very familiar to Americans. He's not really very Israeli in his wingness. He's very international. Orban, Trump,
Talks about
yeah.
the
So he's
deep
like the
state.
thinker of. Sorry.
Yeah, they talk about the Israeli deep state, basically.
Yeah. Very similar to what you're used to hearing. Yeah, and Magal also, he was a charismatic anchor man in the establishment, and he's gone more and more right wing as well. There's a few figures like that. Avri Gilad has gotten more and more right wing. He was on my favorite skit show when I was a kid. He was also a liberal guy from Gal Galatz from the Army Radio. So yeah, there's a bunch of them.
Who's the most important right wing columnist in Israel?
Well, by far the most important voice in sort of sane, opinionated right wing by a mile is Arel Segal. Arel Segal's his father was a fundamentalist terrorist who wanted to bomb the Temple Mount. So he grew up in that kind of house, and he's very right wing, but he's also one of the most brilliant, perceptive minds in analyzing Israeli politics. Like I listen to everything he has to say, not only because he has great connections in the Netanyahu um, court more than anyone else, but also because he has prescient analysis. So I think everyone takes him seriously. He's the one right winger I can think of that everyone listens to
What
because what he
outlet?
says matters.
What
Sorry,
outlet? What
Channel
newspaper?
12,
Oh, so he's
Channel
on
12 News.
TV.
He's on TV. He
And
writes columns too.
what's he
He's
saying
yeah.
these days? Is he boosting Netanyahu or?
Yes, he's definitely boosting Netanyahu. He sees Netanyahu as being undermined by Biden and by the protesters and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Nothing all that unusual about his opinions. What's unusual about him is his competence and prescience, and therefore importance in the discourse, the mainstream discourse, because Channel 12 is a center left station. It's very establishment. It's what used to be Channel 2. And so him having that platform there where he's their most important domestic political correspondent is very important.
Who
And then all the right wingers who share things on Telegram and WhatsApp and all that, they share him as their one of their icons. But also the left listens to him too. So he's the
I
most important by a mile.
and I heard the biggest podcast in Israel is hosted by this guy Mika Goodman, who I just is this true? You know him?
Mika Goodman is
Smart,
he's
smart guy.
yeah, he's too much of an independent thinker to really fall into any of these boxes. He wrote a really good book on the occupation on 1967 about why it's an insoluble problem and how Israel needs to manage it instead of solve it, which was very influential. Um, he's more like a David Brooks type than hard right. Yeah, he's or yeah, he's a thinking man, and he can also sound left when the you know when the spirit strikes him, when he feels that way about that specific issue.
Who's the most
That's why
important?
people listen to him. You never know exactly what he's going to say.
Who's the most important left-wing columnist in Israel?
Well, in Israel or abroad,
In
because
Israel.
Gideon Levy.
In Israel, yeah.
I don't know if anyone. Well, I guess Nahum Barnea and Dan Margalit, the old school. They retain Ron Ben Ishai, the people who have been around since the 70s. They've retained a lot of their cachet and a lot of their influence as well. Um, yeah, I think they still remain the most important
And
left
is
wingers.
there a TV mad out?
Oh, and Chaim Levinson of the younger guard from Haaretz is he's very good with social media. He's very good at sound bites and he's very good in TV too. So he's probably the most outstanding young left winger I can think of.
And is there anyone on TV? Is there a mad owl of Israel?
A what of Israel? Oh,
Rachel
Maddow,
Maddow.
Rachel.
Yeah.
No, actually, we don't have no one I would put in that class. The closest we have is probably Ilana Dayan. Ilana Dayan has an investigative show. It's been going on for a very long time. She does very serious work. But Manow with her PhD and stream of consciousness she's her own thing.
I didn't mean it has to be a Israeli woman. I just meant big left wing TV pundit.
Yeah, we don't have a Manow.
Interesting.
Ilana Dayan's the closest, but yeah, she's more of an investigative journalist than a kind of beloved host. Yeah, you know why Israel doesn't really have those entire hours of opinion that you have on American cable news. Channel 14 has some of that, but that's just not an Israeli format. Israel has news. There'll be an anchor, there'll be a panel, they'll talk. It's more democratic. You'll never have, or rarely have some guy or some woman spouting off for an entire hour. That's not an Israeli format. That's American. That's an American format.
So, did you watch Benny Morris and Destiny debate Norm Finkelstein and?
That was 4 hours, and I have a day job. I saw a couple of clips, and that's as far as it went.
How infuriating is it to see a guy who's read like one book about Israel?
I mean, yeah, you have to wonder if they selected him. I mean, obviously for clicks because he has a large following, but also in order to lose. If you put him up against professors, he's going to lose. Benny Morris is a great choice. Benny Morris is he's had problems with his scholarship over the years, especially in the early years, but he's without a doubt one of the most knowledgeable and respected historians on the conflict. Finkelstein, by the way, is not doesn't really write about the conflict either. He's, very
I
opinionated.
heard he doesn't speak Hebrew. Is that true?
Yeah, he's an American Jew.
But I mean, that is amazing. He can't speak Hebrew. I mean, can he read Hebrew?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, that's not what his scholarship is on, you know?
Sir, excuse me, sir.
It would be good to bring people who know Hebrew. Yeah, listen, a lot of the most anti-Israel scholars, as far as I know, don't know Hebrew. I don't think Rashid Halidi knows Hebrew. He certainly doesn't show any ability to read Hebrew in his scholarship. Benny Mars knows Hebrew and he knows Arabic. Yeah, I guess you would want to bring Ilan Pape if you wanted to bring someone like that. I mean, he does. He's awful in my opinion, but he knows English.
Why
He
is
knows
he
Hebrew and he knows
awful?
Arabic and he knows the conflict.
Why is he awful in your opinion?
He says in his books that he has a political agenda, and then he goes to prove it throughout the book. Like the ethnic cleansing of Palestine book, which is his most influential book, ignores one of the most important facets of the war, which is the war itself, and takes the expulsion of refugees out of context intentionally. Benny Morris, when he wrote about it, he wrote a very controversial book that Israelis hated at the time about the refugees, but he placed it in the context of the war, and that's what a historian does. Benny Morris used to be the darling of the left. That was a different time when you could still be beloved by the left and think Israel should exist. And he's also, he's drifted somewhat to the right, but he was always a Zionist. He just thought that Israel did things that they shouldn't have done. Nowadays, that means that you're a genocide supporter and a Nazi if you think that Israel should exist.
Worse than
And
Nazi. That's what they say.
yeah, and that's what Benny Morris is. Yeah, so I don't think that debate was really about getting the right people for the job. I was surprised that Benny Morris was even there, because everyone else was more of a personality than someone who actually knows something about the conflict.
You know Avi Schleim from
Yeah,
Oxford?
Avi Schleim is a great historian. Avi Schleim is
Oh.
yeah, Avi Schleim is okay. He's a better example than Ilan Pape, actually. So I'm glad you brought him up. Ilan Pape, he has a lot of publications. He's influential. Avi Schleim is at Oxford. Avi Schleim is an Iraqi Jew. He knows Hebrew perfectly. He knows Arabic perfectly. He's a very serious scholar. Uh, you and I would not agree with his opinions. And just like Benny Morris, he's occasionally fudged things, but he's like an equivalent of Benny Morris on the left.
Yeah,
He's a very good historian.
yeah, I was just watching a thing. It was an interesting video, but it was a Palestinian. It was Avi Schleim. It was basically the idea of the video was an Israeli and Palestinian who both want a one-state solution. But throughout it, Schleim is just like, I really don't see myself as Israeli. I sort of hate Israel. I blame Israel for me not growing up in Iraq. I don't live there. I'm never gonna live there.
Yeah, he hates Israel. He hates Israel. He is a serious historian, though. Like
Yeah,
that's his opinions, but
yeah,
he goes to the archives, he writes what
yeah.
he sees,
Right.
he says things that are fair. He sometimes talks about why Israel did things from a security perspective, not as much as I would when I write my stuff, but you know, he's serious. Yeah, he hates Israel. He's not Israeli. He was born in Israel, I believe. But yeah, he sees himself as an Iraqi Jew.
He was born in Iraq, and I think
Oh,
they had to move when he was like
his
5 or 8.
parents, okay, so his parents fled to Israel, and then he showed them his thankfulness for that by besmirching Israel for the rest of his life.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
says.
but serious historian.
Yeah, no, he literally blames Israel rather than the anti-Semites for kicking him out of.
Yeah, he wrote in his book that it was because of the Zionist provocations that the Iraqis wanted to kill the Jews, not because of anti-Semitism, of course, or yeah, nothing like that.
It's hard to believe that Jews were 20%. They were a huge part of Iraq. Like the amount of real estate they left behind was huge, but And Ben Veer is Iraqi Jewish, but he's not classified as a refugee. But Gigi Hadid, the supermodel, who's half Danish, half Palestinian, and born in Beverly Hills in 1993, is a refugee of 1948.
Yeah, well, I've always opposed the idea of thinking of the Israelis of the people who came from the Arab countries to Israel as refugees, like some right wingers have said, because I believe that when you go to Israel, you go home, and when
Right.
you go home, you're not a refugee.
Right.
So I think that's self-defeating to the Zionism to say that they're
Right.
refugees. And Ben Gvir was of course born in Israel. But yeah, but as far as what you said about Iraq, it's more than that. Baghdad was considered a Jewish city, and the majority of the population of Baghdad at the turn of the century was Jewish. The majority. Most of the Arabs were falahim living, in the villages or in other cities. Baghdad was Jewish. Baghdad was the Jewish trade center. Yeah.
Yeah, but my point was simply that there's this special classification where somebody born in 1993 to a Danish
It's
mother.
it's a travesty. It's a travesty, and it keeps the conflict going forever, which was the point. That was the point. There's Palestinians deserve some historical justice for what happened to them, but saying that all the Palestinians are refugees that need to return home is not solving anything, because that's where Israelis live now. Israelis are not giving up their homes. The best thing is for people to live more or less where they are, and receive justice, and live side by side as much as possible,
How
rather than replacing each other through ethnic cleansing on one side or the other.
how do you keep perspective? This is something I struggle with, and I think the term for this is called nut picking, which is you take the worst out of a group you oppose and then you define it by its worst, and then it's sort of this cycle. For instance, there was and I'll just call it anti-Israel protest outside of Biden fundraiser in New York, and one of the people called this woman I'll just say a K word, pretty disgusting stuff. How do you personally check yourself from radicalizing, and seeing that entire movement as, I mean, I do believe there's so much anti-Semitism there, but there's also some reasonable points. You know what I mean? Like how do you struggle with that?
It's tough. Ultimately, I try not to be distracted by the noise. The noise is exactly what you're describing. Um, Terrible people saying terrible things, sometimes doing terrible things. Um, None of that changes the fact that there are policies that can be promoted that can lower the flames. And if you lower the flames, you'll have less psychos on both sides. Of course, the problem is those psychos also try to ruin anything reasonable that you try to do. So you can't ignore them. But I think that people respond to situations. I think that movements respond to situations. The same person who is unreasonable now could be more reasonable in a year or two. I've seen the Palestinians go through various phases. I've seen the Israelis go through various phases. Um, One thing I remind myself of is I think of, let's say, the Stanford, prisoner experiment, where you put people in a certain position and they act horrible, then you take them out of that position and they're normal undergrads again. And I think it's the same thing with conflict. When it rises to a certain level, everyone becomes insane. If you manage to lower the conflict, people start acting more sane. So don't take your eye off the ball. Don't get caught up in the noise. Um, what people are trying to do who are picking out the worst in other groups, and I do this sometimes myself on social media. I'm no better than anyone else. I do it too. What you're trying to do when you do that is say, look, everyone in this group is terrible. We shouldn't be dealing with them. But once you're doing that, you're dooming everyone to eternal conflict. And it's counterproductive. And it's also not the truth. The truth isn't that everyone on the other side is always insane and wants to kill you. A lot of it depends on the circumstances. And if we make the circumstances better, people will act better. That's how I try to rationalize it.
I feel like I need Israel, especially the far right, needs a wake up call in a few different ways. and it sort of needs to realize, like, these fantasies, we'll just move all the Palestinians out. They need to realize, like, that's not going to work. Like, you will destroy your relationship with the U.S., okay? They need a wake-up call on that. And they also need a wake-up call on, there's a longer-term clock with the young people. It's not just young, it's also the fact that the demographics of America and Europe are changing. There's a lot more Arab and Muslim in this next generation. And that it might be the case that you need to cut a deal and some kind of settlement on this two-state thing in the next 20 years because you're going to get your best terms in this window. And it's scary to me that this idea that, oh, we'll always have America. We can do whatever we want. Has anything in the 6 months of protests, has anything given that wake-up call?
No, because these people that you're talking about, they think that God protects Israel, not anything real. So the only way they would ever wake up is if Israel did all these things and the repercussions became apparent, and then some of them would be like, oh, maybe that was a mistake, but that would be too late. So you can't, there's really no one to talk to on the extreme right. They're fanatics. You can talk to the moderate right, and the moderate right is turning on Netanyahu, and that's where you need to do your work. Same thing in the United States with the anti-Trump Nikki Haley types. If you want to get anything done, those are the people you need to work with. You can't work with the MAGA people, and you can't work with the far left. So those of us who are more moderate on the left need to work with the moderate right.
Netanyahu's not coming to America to give a speech, right? That's not happening. Please tell me.
My guess is he will.
No. That is horrible.
Prepare for that.
I don't know if you listen to the podcast Call Me Back that Dan Senor does, and I really like it. It's good, and he has Haviv Rediger on it. It's very good, but when that Economist cover came out of Israel Alone, he said, I see no evidence, and then the next day, the UN vote happened. These people who will never blame Netanyahu. It's like, oh, the relationship just is so bad with America. It's all Biden's fault. And it's like, this guy has been in power for many Americans' entire life, basically, for Israel. This is his doing.
He's running the war effort, and yeah, I have right wingers explaining to me right now ad nauseum why Israel can't go into Rafah. When they're supposed to be the right wingers, I'm supposed to be the left winger, right? They're explaining to me why Israel can't use military force there because Netanyahu's not doing it. Yeah, whatever he does is fine. October 7th, he's not responsible. Yeah, there's a cult of personality around him. Luckily, in Israel, that cult of personality is a lot smaller than it was before the war. Their numbers are dwindling. If he had that kind of support, he wouldn't be so afraid of elections. But he is.
To wrap up,
yeah.
Who is your dream? I'll let you create this figure of the next Israeli PM. Because I think about it all the time. Like, what would I do to resurrect Israel's image? To do things. It doesn't have to be a two-state solution, but just gestures to change the narrative. To, let a crew from CNN follow the police as you arrest violent settlers. Be proud of it. We're going to start arresting violent settlers today. Announce it in front of the U.S. Congress, and we're sorry for this. And so we're paying this family, the olive farmers. That's what I dream of. Do you have any dreams of that, of what the perfect next PM would do?
Oh boy. Yeah, well, I really want a PM in Israel who will try to unite people around a patriotic message of sanity, unity, and stop expanding settlements. Talk to the PA, say that demand reforms from the PA, but in order to move towards a Palestinian state, respect the institutions of Israel, repair relations with the United States and the EU, um, and yeah, try to build a rapport with the Palestinians while also normalizing relations with other countries in the Middle East, not one of these this or that situations. And in order for him to be able to do all this stuff, it would have to be a general with a long history of service to the country, because other people are not trusted to make concessions. Even someone like that, like Rabin, had so many problems, but someone like Shimon Peres, who wasn't a war hero, could never do that. And I think there's a once in a lifetime opportunity after this war to do this. Demographics haven't changed Israel yet. Israel's have become, in many ways, more moderate as a result of this war, turning against Netanyahu. I know it doesn't seem that way in terms of rhetoric towards the Palestinians, but they're ready for something more sane and more normal. And we have certain individuals who would more or less fit that bill, whether we're talking about Yoav Gallant, or we're talking about Gadi Eisenkot, or we're talking about Benny Gantz. Those are three people I look at who could be figure like that.
I heard Yossi Cohen, who you pointed out before on Unholy podcast, and he sort of intrigues me. I forgot last thing, the PA. They might change the pay for slay policy. I still hear all these Israelis, and I know there's so many problems with the PA, but they just denigrate them and say, oh, they can't do it. How much of a risk is it that Israel's going to get stuck in like a peacekeeping thing in Gaza for years if they don't
peacekeeping is not the word you're looking for. Permanent occupation is the term for how likely is that? Incredibly likely. I don't really see another option unless the government changes and someone else goes in, and even then there'll be so much resistance, especially once Netanyahu sets in stone whatever occupation he's doing. Yeah, right now there's only two outcomes. There's either an Israeli occupation, fully fledged, or failed state Somalia style, or some kind of combination where Israel controls certain areas and the rest of it's Somalia failed state style. That's the most likely right now. That's what's happening, unless there's a day after plan is a day after mechanism put in place of a different government. That's what's gonna happen. Or Hamas is there. Yeah, Hamas failed state Israeli occupation, some combination of the three.
What about the PA becoming the government?
Well, Israel has to let them in and support them. If Israel doesn't let them in and support them, the PA can't do it on its own. The PA is weak. The PA is dependent on Israel. The PA exists in the West Bank only because Israel makes sure that it stays there. Despite everything Israel says, Israel's kept it there all the time. If Israel doesn't uphold the PA is not going to be in Gaza. No one's going to keep them alive. Hamas will slaughter them in 5 minutes. They can't even enter there. We need to put them in there.
Is there anyone in Israel who says what I believe, which is, I probably told you before, when Israelis, I hear them complain about how much the West Bank supports Hamas, I always say, put yourself in their shoes and see how they view a boss who basically is impotent to stop any settlement expansion. It makes him look like a clown. And so, of course, they're going to support the guys who do something. Is there anyone in Israel making that case?
Yeah, lots of people. Lots of people. But if you want to be a mainstream politician who actually gets votes nowadays, you have to sort of fudge that a bit. So your Merit says that. Merav Michaeli, who was the head of labor, says things like that. But from Yair Lapid to rightward, they all know that. These are smart people. Yeah. They know it. They don't say it. They don't say it in public. I'll tell you something else. Deep down inside, every Israeli knows what you're saying is true. Every single one, I think. The reason there's several reasons people don't say it. One, they want to get elected, and two, there's people whose biggest nightmare in the world is a two-state solution, even one that would kind of work. Even what you and I, when we think of a two-state solution, we think of something that would work quite badly, honestly, but would work better than what's happening now. That's what you and I see, I think. I have no illusions. They're not going to be Switzerland, But to a lot of people in Israel, that's a nightmare scenario. To have a not that great Palestinian state there taking over what they consider to be holy land is something that they just don't want. So they know all that, but they knowingly say, they'll tell you, you'll see people tell you all the time, the PA is as bad as Hamas. No, the PA is worse than Hamas because Hamas doesn't pretend. The PA pretends. I hear that all the time. They know that's not true, but they'll say it because the last thing they want is a Palestinian state.
The sanctions
Sure.
on settlers.
Yeah.
Is there other things that America can do that could stop the settlement expansion, or is it not really?
Well, this is the topic of my dissertation, by the way, and the book of mine that's coming out later this year, U.S. Policy on the Settlements. The short answer to your question is no. No, Israel can't, the United States cannot stop Israeli settlement expansion while maintaining what gives it its influence, which is its role as a patron. If it chose to cut that off, that would eventually um, make Israel stop with the settlements, but that's not realistic. The United States has never considered the settlements to be important enough to do that. If the relationship were to rupture, it probably wouldn't be over the settlements. So realistically speaking, all the U.S. can do is make it clear that it's unhappy with it. Trying to push Israel into doing that with too much without cutting the main levers of its influence over Israel, the UN resolution, the arms, all that won't work because politically Israel's not going to give up the settlements. And if it does cut those, it will lose its influence over Israel, you know? So basically the answer is no. No, the US can't stop the settlements. Israel needs to decide that they're counterproductive. Um, I fear that that might happen after something that'll make October 7th look good, you know, in 20 years from now, 30 years from now. There'll be some event with the Palestinians that will threaten the very existence of the state of Israel, not just kill a bunch of people and, you know, and all that stuff. And maybe it'll be too late.
Yeah, what I'm scared of is October 7th from the West Bank and how that would radicalize.
We have no idea what the next crisis is going to look like. West Bank will, you're right that if the West Bank's involved, it'll be much worse. We don't know what it'll look like, but it will look terrible. And yeah.
Name 4 people who know more about Israel and Palestine than you, or 3.
Sure. Dennis Ross, Benny Morris, Avi Schleim, and my mentor and advisor for my PhD thesis, David Tal.
Okay. What about Twitter accounts people should follow on this subject that you look to?
If you're not following me, you're not.
Everybody's following you, of course, but who else?
Okay. If you don't, you have to follow Barak Ravid first and foremost, above everyone else. Not even close. If you know Hebrew, you're gonna want to follow Amit Segal as well. You're going to want to follow Suleiman Musweda from Channel 13. Oh, you're going to want to follow Haviv Retek Gur, who's absolutely excellent. Yeah, I think those are some major. I'm sure I'm forgetting people, but those are some major people to follow.
Yeah, I know that, Shaiel, you will know what you're talking about because all these expert journalists, think tank guys retweet you all day. So thank you so much for talking to me, Shaiel, and we just hope for the best. We hope that next time we talk, this thing is over and the suffering is, gone down. But thank you so much, man.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.